me. I'm so excited. I don't grow much, but it's like that one thing I have at least figured out.
Okay, and so we're gonna start this off on a gardening note. Um, Before I left, I ordered a big bag of Vidalia onions from Georgia, and I was told that if you chop it off, and they did a whole bunch of other stuff that I didn't bother doing, but if you put it down in like a glass where you cut off like the root part of it, that if you put it in water and let just the part of the onion that you normally just cut off and throw away, so it sits on the surface of the water, that it will have little green sprouts that come out. And then you can plant that and grow your own onion. So we'd been back for a couple of days, and I looked on the bar where I had set the glass with the onion in it. And I looked at my husband, I'm like, oh my God, there's sprouts on it. So I'm going to go out and plant it after we get done. I've never grown an onion before. So,
That's awesome. I mean, hey, that's I I did a great garden last year, and this spring I just did not have the oomph to do it. So I just focused on like strawberries and cantaloupe. I figured if I could get those two out, I would be I could survive on cantaloupe and strawberries.
so for those of you who have just recently joined our podcast or space or whatever, um, Bridget shipped me some of her cantaloupe last year, and they were amazing. And for the first time ever in all of the work that Bridget and I have done together, I'm going to actually get to meet her in August in Nashville. And she's going to bring me some cantaloupe. So that's the reason why we're talking about it. We have to make sure that there's some ripe when we get together. So we are going to spend 3 or 4 days doing nothing but chit chatting, sitting on the edge of the water, which is where this RV park is that we're going to be, and eating cantaloupe all day. I don't know what the guys are going to do, but I know what we're going to do.
Right? I mean, how much better could you get? And coffee, by the way.
And
I ordered my
coffee.
coffee.
Oh, good.
My starter kit. So I'll have good coffee and cantaloupe. What more could you ask for? And good company.
Yes, and I will have my coffee with me as well. So, and I'll have the coffee maker. All right. So now that the chit chat's out of the way, we're going to start back where we left off on chapter 3. And this is where it gets good, guys, in a really evil, bad kind of way. So we've got all the prep work out of the way. Now, again, Lincoln Gordon, who we've talked about the last couple of chapters, is the guy that got selected to be the new ambassador in Brazil. So by mid 1961, Lincoln Gordon, his wife, and their youngest daughter moved to Brazil. And Goulart has taken office. He starts making his cabinet appointments, and Gordon is watching as these different people get elect or appointed to office, because they're basically grading Goulart on the appointments that he makes. Are they really kind of very liberal, or are they conservative, or whatever? He's not going to be able to do anything right anyway, but they are monitoring that. And so they're kind of middle of the road people. There's not real big standouts on either side. And he said, had the professor been grading Goulart's appointments publicly, Brazil might have noticed that the ones that he deemed too liberal would have gotten a failing grade. Because remember, that's where this guy's background is, Lincoln Gordon. So despite the creation of Brasilia, foreign diplomats had proved unwilling to move out of the Rio area. So that's kind of where the ambassador moved to. The U.S. Embassy operated in a 10-story building with a view of the water. And to the rear of the building was one of the big mountainous areas. So it was a beautiful location where they were at. Gouliart is not known to have ever published anything in writing about what he thought of the ambassador, but the ambassador printed what he thought of Gouliart. And basically, he said that he was an extrovert and very crude. He had a really poor opinion of him, but that's kind of the briefings that he got at the State Department before he came as well. So he was predisposed to not like him. But they met. He was given his credentials to be the ambassador. And the president said that I'm going to be visiting Rio shortly, and that he invited the ambassador to come see him. So probably the most important thing that happened in Gordon's attitude was the fact that Gouliart was not to be trusted, which is kind of what he was told by the State Department when he got there. The opposition lost no time in making itself known to the new ambassador. The opposition to Gouliart inside of Brazil. The first guy that makes this known was a admiral named Silvio Heck, Heck. He had actually had a social connection to Gordon because in 1946, Heck's niece had met Gordon at a UN meeting on atomic energy. They had renewed that acquaintance later when Gordon had toured Brazil. Guess who paid for his trip to Brazil? None other than the Ford Foundation. Now she called and made an appointment with the ambassador and told him that she was hosting a party and her uncle wanted to meet with him privately. So he goes to the party, and Heck whisks him off to a side room and says, when I was a Navy minister for Quadros, I opposed Gouliart. He's a communist, he said, and he wants to deliver the country to them. To you, he may appear to be a moderate. The sooner he's thrown out, the better. He goes on to say that we have polled everybody in the services, and 75% of the Army, much of the Air Force, and 80% of the Navy feel the same way about him. And we are organizing a resistance. We do not need your help, but when the day comes, we hope the U.S. takes an understanding view. All the U.S. ambassador responded was, that's very interesting. He didn't press him for any additional information, nor did Gordon relay that information to the president. The next day, Gordon called in his deputy and the CIA station chief and asked him to check the veracity of what Heck had said. They reported back and said Heck basically is full of crap. There is only a handful of officers that feel that way in the military at the more senior rank or even in the middle ranks. It had been predictable that the sort of Brazilians Gordon had met over the years would oppose a government that he was now accredited to be assigned to. His acquaintance with a man by the name of Paulo Ayres, Ayres Jr., dated back to 1959, when Ayres was the head of a Brazilian American cultural center in Sao Paulo. He was also a businessman. He was young, personable, and spoke perfect English. When Gordon was asked to suggest a Brazilian delegate to a multinational business conference, He remembered him, and he and Ayres had the pleasure of a reunion in Washington. Now that Gordon was in Brazil as the ambassador, he looked Ayres up and met with his friends that were also corporate members in the local area. In good time, Ayres described to Gordon a political organization that he was creating with the cumbersome but innocent name of the Institute for Social Research Studies. In Portuguese, its initials was IPES, IPES. Had Gordon been able to recognize the underpinnings of this IPES, he would have known immediately that it looked exactly like Robert Welch's John Birch Society. In Brazil, the motivating spirit for IPES was Glycone de Paiva, Paiva, P-A-I-V-A. Paiva was a mining engineer at a very large mining concern. And remember that most of the mining that was being done in Brazil at the time the U.S. had concessions on it. From the day of Goulard's inauguration, de Paiva had known that the new president was going to be a menace and that he must be removed. De Paiva was often said to look like a minister. He made normal rounds. There goes the video on Rumble. Sorry about that, guys. He made normal rounds to all of the other industrialists, spreading his warning. Although they had lavish gifts to his crusade, they didn't necessarily want their names associated with it, but they donated heavily to this IPES organization. Sounding the alarm, de Paiva had no trouble raising each month over $20,000 a month. He began to expand the scope of his organization. Paulo Ayres Jr. became the chief IPES representative in Sao Paulo. De Paiva's greatest inspiration was to hire as his chief of staff a retired general from the army by the name of Golbe do Souto Silva. They had their office on the 27th floor of a very large building in Rio. De Paiva encouraged the general to complete dossiers on everyone he considered to be an enemy of the nation, i.e., all of the people that supported the president. Before they were done, they had accumulated over 400,000 files on individual Brazilians to target. Their standard method was to put informers on IPES payroll. Many of them were actually soldiers on active duty to go out and gather information on their fellow Brazilians. De Paiva also paid informers in factories, schools, and government offices. Petrobras, the state oil company, was his special target because he suspected Goulart of riddling its organization with his own supporters. At the universities, de Paiva believed that they were afforded too much freedom and that there needed to be people to spy on them as well. The priesthood was another concern of de Paiva's because there was a large amount of priests from Belgium and France, so he viewed them as suspect. To evade detection and possible reprisals against IPES, its directors tried to represent it as an educational organization. And in fact, it even donated to a few local charities, like educating farmers' children and stuff like that, just to kind of cover their tracks. DePava wanted to learn more about economic theory, so he hired someone to come in and basically give his staff at IPES a tutorial on free enterprise and economics. IPES could afford the tutorials. In Brazil, printing the telephone business directories was a lucrative private business, and its owner, Gilbert Huber Jr., was one of the men who supported DePava with lots of money. Huber was also financially involved in American Light and Power, which owned 80% of the company. US owned 80% of that company. Brazil's largest banks and corporate construction companies was also generous contributors, because they basically were hired by US businesses that had been coming in to exploit the market down there. Nor did DePava meet resistance from the most significant embassy in Brazil, i.e., the US Embassy. Through Paulo Ayres and General Golbery, DePava was introduced to Ambassador Gordon, and the two men would meet time to time. Gordon found DePava a smart fellow who was managing IPES with great skill, whereas DePava had decided that Gordon was a very simple man. And when he was pressed too much at cocktail parties, he basically just said, "I'm the ambassador here. Put yourself in my place," meaning that the ambassador was smart enough not to commit to treason within this country. Not that it's treason, but you know what I mean. A guy by the name of Aristotle Luiz Drummond was a student in Rio and an aspiring comrade in arms to DePava's cause. He tapped an even wealthier treasurer than Gilbert Huber's. By chance, Drummond had stumbled on to the CIA, and the CIA is going to be his financier. He met with a couple of CIA agents, and we'll get to that in just a second. At 18, Drummond founded an organization called GAP, and it was basically like a group of patriots. That's kind of what it translated to. Its natural enemy was the National Student Union, and the National Student Union had more people in their group. So Drummond was very particular about who he handed out leaflets to, and they didn't have at the time a very large budget, so he was very careful. He also went around spray painting at night graffiti on buildings of corporate owners that were not as conservative as he felt they should be. One day on a local radio station, he was interviewed. That interview was picked up by the CIA's Voice of America and rebroadcast. The exposure of that is what brought the CIA to his doorstep. So they met with him, kind of did an initial inquiry, went away, and came back and made a proposition to him, and basically said, "We can help you. We can get you literature, i.e. propaganda, and we can get you money." Just a few weeks later, a truck pulled up to Drummond's. Well, it's actually his mom's house. He was living in their basement. Sound familiar? And offloaded 50,000 books. Here's the names of the books: China, Communist in Perspective; Another book, The Political War, The Arm of International Communism. Another book was basically Instruments of Subversion. He was to hand out all of these books to basically the general student population around Brazil, scaring them of anything that gets labeled communist, which of course we know the CIA loves to label everything communist in order to be able to attack it. So he takes this and immediately starts spreading all of these new books, courtesy of the CIA, around the area. Okay. De Pava, meanwhile, now he's got the student piece of this going. He starts concentrating on housewives. He begins a propaganda campaign basically telling all of the local housewives that communism is going to destroy their beautiful Brazil. They set up an organization called Women's Campaign for Democracy, CAMD. He began giving selected women rumors to spread around of outrages that Goulart and his cronies were supposedly planning. Not anything that he had ever done, just this stuff. Oh, he's going to do this awful thing, and oh, he's going to do that awful thing. De Pava referred to it as, quote unquote, good gossip. So De Pava began concentrating on disaffected military men and pious housewives. Civilians were also enrolling in the conspiracy against Goulart through a front organized by the CIA called Institute Brazil Democracy. IBAD was its acronym. Writers on the Goulart era later puzzled over how much Ambassador Gordon knew of all of the various CIA activities. The agency's rule was that you provide the ambassador as much information as he wants to hear. So it's either he knows or he doesn't know on purpose. Certainly, Gordon knew all about IBAD because it was being ran out of his embassy. The older IPES and GAP, he may or may not have known about. So IBAD became the means of channeling CIA money to local political campaigns, which was a violation of Brazil's law. So they were breaking the law. IBAD passed on money through two different branches, one called Democratic Popular Action and the other called Sales Promotion Inc., which was basically a CIA front company. During the elections in 1962, Popular Action underwrote the campaigns of more than 1,000 candidates. In some cases, IBAD actually recruited candidates to run for office. In other words, they paid people and then they paid for their campaigns. They all understood that their loyalty was to IBAD, which was basically the CIA. Most of the CIA candidates, some 600, ran for state deputy. Another 250 ran for federal deputy, and 15 for the federal Senate. 8 ran for governorships in one of the Brazil's 20 different states. IBAD underwrote the campaign of Jorge de Oliveira for governor. It was an important race because the alternative was Miguel Arias, who they absolutely didn't like. It was an impoverished region that Washington regarded as ripe for revolution. One indication of the Kennedy's administration's concern had been a visit in June 1961 by the president's youngest brother, Edward Kennedy, a 29-year-old assistant district attorney from Massachusetts. Kennedy was scheduled to meet with representatives of the Peasant League, although the best known organizer of those leagues was out of town, mysteriously. Missed the meeting. Francisco de Paula, who had been born into a family of sugar plantation owners, but he was no typical gentleman of the mill. In his adolescence, he had read a book by Friedrich Engels. From the time on, he considered himself a man of the left, as one of the few lawyers in the Northeast who would represent the poor. The young man, nicknamed Francesco Julia, built a following and went to his state legislature in 1954 as the Brazilian Socialist Party's sole successful candidate. Landowners in the Northeast still took the kingly view that God had decreed them to be wealthy, and they resisted any effort to organize the workers on their estates. The more harassed and threatened the peasants felt, the more radical their league became. During the Eisenhower years, politicians from Brazil's largest southern cities had persuaded a U.S. foreign aid official in the Northeast that the Northeast was so destitute that any money spent there would be wasted. To Lincoln Gordon, the best solution was a massive resettlement that would lure farmers hundreds of miles south and west to better land. Kind of like we did in Vietnam. The ambassador's wife encountered a prevailing spirit at a town. At a dinner party when she heard wealthy Brazilians speak of a town in the Northeast. So she knew about this town, but everybody at the dinner party kept saying it doesn't even exist. They didn't even recognize those people because they were basically slaves to these plantation owners. The U.S. intelligence apparatus took Julio's constituency more seriously. Equally suspect was an educator named Paulo Freire, who, under the guise of teaching farm workers to read, was instigating them to question the conditions of being slaves on their plantations. Were these men more like Fidel Castro? Lincoln Gordon asked. CIA operatives began to distribute leaflets promoting Julio's appearance at rallies he knew nothing about. In other words, more propaganda. The farmers would come out in droves to see their champion, but he would not appear because it was a lie. And somehow a fight would break out. Rumors were also circulated painting both Julio and Gouliart as really bad people. Ambassador Gordon was not adverse to gossip and readily passed along stories about Gouliart and his wife, that he had blackened her eyes, that he was having an affair. Gordon knew how such stories wounded a man's honor, especially in Brazil. As for Julio, although he and his wife Alexina, living in a land that did not recognize divorce, apparently had agreed on what came to be known as an open marriage. Stories of her affairs had never circulated until the CIA began basically tailing him. Years later, a Brazilian journalist traveling in Pernambuco heard of the CIA's compiling and printing of false documents to prove that Julio was a communist. Other events overtook that particular strategy. For the CIA, there were many enemies in his area just besides Ferrari and Julio. By early 1962, the agencies had 2 full-time men working out of the local consulate. And by the way, at the beginning of Gordon's tenure there, they like doubled and tripled the amount of consulates throughout Brazil. So now you have more stations in all of the different states to house CIA operatives. Other CIA agents were placed within these seemingly straightforward groups as the Cooperative League of the United States of America and the American Institute of Free Labor Development, which is kind of the precursor to the labor element of National Endowment for Democracy. No one's allowed to organize labor movements against U.S. corporations outside of America. The Labor Development Office was a creature of of the early 60s, a merger of talent and funds from the CIA, the AFL-CIO, and some 60 U.S. corporations, including Anaconda, which we see again in Chile, ITT, which we see again in Chile, Pan America Airlines, which we saw often in several other Operation Gladios. Its purpose was to stop, originally, it was to stop Castro from undermining the Latin American labor movement, but it was used in order to get jackboots out on the ground. At least one U.S. labor attaché from an embassy felt in watching the labor organization disrupt Brazil's progress in labor organizing under the guise of protecting the workers from communism. That was his opinion. So they basically were disrupting unions for U.S. oligarchs by scaring the hell out of them and using communism as an excuse. By 1963, in addition to field work, the AIFLD, the labor part of it, was arranging a training session in Washington for 33 trustworthy labor leaders, who then returned to Brazil and took over clandestine roles in the anti-Goulart conspiracy. The farm workers of the Northeast then had reason to be suspicious of any outsider and all police, whom they regarded as agents of the CIA. During Ted Kennedy's visit, their spokesman asked that his brother withdraw the U.S. police advisors. When Miguel Arres won the governorship the next year, he let it be understood that he did not want Byron Ingalls men in his state. Those are the people of the Office of Public Safety, where we find Dan Mederone. We don't have enough advisors to cover all Brazil in any event. Of course, we shall limit them to only the friendly states. But in Washington, that put Arares on their list of enemies. Despite differences in age and occupation, most plotters against the Brazilian president shared a common estimate of their fellow citizens. Drummond said gently that Brazilians do not understand politics. They're too dumb. De Paiva was very much blunter. He went on to say that Brazil was not ready for democracy. We need a dictator. The military, whether on active duty or in the reserves, found De Paiva's thinking along their lines. At least some of them. At the telephone company, the printers, the guys that are contributing basically to the overthrow of their company, we meet Hector Herrera, a retired general active in the campaign against Goulart. He felt it was inevitable and only proper that he and his fellow army officers lead the nation to its destiny. Perhaps it was only an accident of history, but they were better equipped for the task than any other element of society. Herrera did not maintain that military officers were smarter, merely better trained, and that training meant that they should be in charge of what was going to happen. Herrera was proud enough of his stint at the U.S. Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to keep his diploma hung proudly on his wall. We trained them all. Few Brazilians would dispute that training at the hands of the U.S. left Latin American officers, whether from the army or the police, with a new sense of direction and authority. One reason was the care and attention that U.S. training lavished on their political thinking. For instance, under Byron Ingalls' direction, a student at the police academy devoted 165 class hours, about 1/3 of his total studies, to internal security and methods of investigation. Of those hours, 55 were given over to warnings about the Communist Party. In other words, these are propaganda brainwashing sessions in order to promote the boogeyman. In 1963, a group of nationalistic high school students were amazed to find that young policemen in their neighborhood, once the butt of so many jokes, returning from the Inter-American Police Academy in Panama, which was basically ran by the CIA, with a new swagger. One such student questioned a recent graduate and found that he now saw himself as marching in the front lines against communism. He had also brought back a profound distrust of his president. These attempts by Washington to instill pride and duty into Brazil's uniformed forces dated back more than 40 years from the moment the U.S. naval mission in Latin America was established in Brazil in 1922. Until then, Brazilian officers had trained either in Germany or with the French, who maintained a mission in Brazil between 1919 and 1940. Let me see something here. I'm trying to mess with my camera. The Second World War gave Washington a justification for expanding its influence even more widely in the Brazilian forces. Military planning was coordinated by Joint Brazilian-U.S. Military Commission, and by the war's end, Brazilian training and equipment was so thoroughly followed the U.S. model that nationalists protested that the only thing Brazilian in their Independence Day was a flag. In the first years of peace, the U.S. unloaded surplus infantry and Air Force equipment on Brazil at about 10% of the cost. Among other things, the Brazilians bought more than 100 combat aircraft. At that discount, naturally, they could hardly expect the latest models, and it had been standard practice from the early days of the Krupp dynasty, Krupp, for munition makers to dump their obsolete equipment on the dictators in Latin America. The weapons, after all, were more likely to be means for keeping its own people quiet than waging wars against each other. In other words, Operation Gladio. Let's give them all the weapons to use domestically. In 1949, the Pentagon helped Brazil set up and staff a copy of its U.S. National War College. It had, it was registered with the UN as a permanent, the organization that set that up, as a permanent agency for handling military sales and assistance to Brazil. At the same time, the U.S. began creating a military training infrastructure for the continent as a whole. In 1949, the School of Americas was opened at Fort Gulick in the Panama Canal Zone, giving courses exclusively in Spanish and Portuguese. So many of its ambitious graduates went home with a fervor that brooked no civil interference that the school became known as the School of Coups throughout Latin America. In 1952, a jungle warfare school was opened at Fort Sherman, also in Panama. Training courses for Latin American flyers at Albrook Air Force Base in Panama dated back to 1943. Those student pilots had to await the onset of the Vietnam War to be instructed in dropping napalm. The most prestigious of all training went on at Fort Leavenworth, and many of the officers who were conspiring now to challenge Gouliart had trained there as well. Those men left Leavenworth, remarked a U.S. general who once served there, with a burning ambition to identify with the U.S. and to be loved by their U.S. counterparts. With such support from the world's strongest power serving in the Brazilian army or navy, it became a desirable middle-class way of life. After the homegrown military academies, a promising officer went for graduate work to a Brazilian military college or one in the US, where he would be exposed to economics, social science, and administration. Men like Herrera never questioned that those years of training outstripped anything a man would receive at civilian universities. Only the military was training men for today and tomorrow. The proof was the speed with which a retiring officer could find a well-paying job in industry in Brazil owned by U.S. oligarchs. Even when an officer did not get to a top school at Leavenworth, training in the U.S. could change his life. Alfredo Peck, the son of a physics professor, went to the Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg in 1961, where many of our assassins were trained in Operation Gladio. His 3-month course in propaganda and psychological warfare at Bragg opened a whole new career for him. Peck was tall for a Brazilian officer and was the product of German parents. He had a receding hairline, his eyes were weak. He was also methodical and hardworking, and he found 12 hours of training each day at Bragg pleasurable. Peck also especially was struck by the competence of the CIA men that he met at Fort Bragg. He decided it was the best intelligence service in the world and regretted that Brazil had no counterpart. Peck was starting to believe the old adage, man is a unviable social product. But as the chaos of Gouliart's democracy, it was hard for an officer like young Peck to see how he could use the psychological warfare training to help his country. The strong government had appealed to many military officers was not the sort that Gouliart had in mind. He had always warned that he did not intend to be a Queen of England, a mere figurehead. And by 1962, he had resolved to sponsor a referendum that would restore his full powers. To marshal support, at least to diffuse Washington's hostility, Gouliart went to the White House to meet John F. Kennedy. In their talks, Gouliart and Kennedy discussed the ballot initiative to return his full authority. Gouliart also put forth a plan for peaceable buying up of foreign utilities operating in Brazil. He seemed to want to avoid the outright expropriation that had helped sour relations with Cuba. When the talks adjourned, Kennedy agreed to visit in July. Upon Gouliart's return to Brazil, he may have felt that his politics of reconciliation with Washington had gone too far, and he compensated with a rousing May Day speech that caused any small hope around the U.S. Embassy to wane once more. Nonetheless, Lincoln Gordon had to go on meeting with him because it was his job. And he found that the Brazilian president was full of surprises. At the time, the missile crisis in October 1962, Gordon went to brief Gouliart on the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. he took along Lieutenant Colonel Vernon Walters. Vernon Walters. SR 71, if you'll post his wiki page, Vernon Walters is bad juju. He just happened to be the new military attaché. He's wearing a uniform, but he is 100% CIA. And he just so happens to show up in time for a coup. Through his service with the Brazilian Expeditionary Force during the Second World War, Walters was the best connected U.S. official in Brazil, being particularly close to Army General Huberto Castillo Branco. Walters possessed a natural flair for language. He had been Richard Nixon's interpreter during the trip to South America that saw the vice president insulted and stoned. Sometimes Walters would worry aloud to his friends that his extreme facility as an interpreter had slowed down his promotion and other assignments. Gouliard listened to the ambassador's report, interrupting only to say, I thought Rusk was said lately that those arms were purely defensive. Gordon thought, so he's aware of what's going on? Yes, but now we have evidence to the contrary. Well, Ambassador, Gouliard said, if that's true, it's not just a threat to you, it's a threat to all of us. Be assured of our solidarity on the matter. Because, of course, Gouliard knew that the U.S. had already placed missiles in Turkey. He knew exactly what was going on. This momentary rapport was not enough to temper Gordon's conviction that the Brazilian president himself was a greater danger. Gouliard might not be a communist, but he would try to emulate Vargas and stage a coup within his own government to obtain even greater powers. So thought Gordon. Since he was so erratic, according to Gordon, and inept, that move would only open the way for a takeover of his country of this fictitious communist threat. Because men who already hold their country's highest office rarely overthrow their own government, there was no word Gordon and his advisors could find to describe what they accused Gouliard of plotting. It fell to the ambassador to invent something. He took pride in his aptness and ingenuity. Anyone working from beneath a government to overthrow it was engaged in, wait for it, subversion. Gouliard was going to create subversion. You can't make this shit up. By getting his presidential powers back that should never have been taken away from him. JFK chose not to repay Gouliard's visit. Instead, he sent his brother Robert to Brazil in the December of 1962. Gordon sat in on the meetings between the Attorney General of the U.S. and the President of Brazil, and he saw that Bobby Kennedy had neither the time nor the talent for Latin America. It's been a turbulent period, Kennedy told Gouliard, but now that you're back to a fresh start, a real opportunity for moving ahead. A few weeks later, by a margin of 4-1, the voters returned full presidential powers to Gouliard. Kennedy continued, we can offer our cooperation and support. However, should you flirt with romantic left-wing causes and give weight to communism and their friends, should that mood dominate, then it will be difficult for us to cooperate. That will be bad for you and bad for Brazil. In a Brazilian phrase, Gouliard asked for particulars. He asked him to name names. Kennedy and Gordon mentioned Almino Afonso, the labor minister, whom the U.S. Embassy considered radical, and a general at Petrobras, the national oil company. When Gouliard shuffled his cabinet early the next year, he left in office the men whom Gordon had considered bad. At dinner, Gouliard asked the ambassador, "You remember the visit of Roberto Kennedy? How do you think he'll like my new cabinet?" Gordon said, "It's a mixed bag." "Oh," Gouliard said cheerfully, "I can keep an eye on them." With the help of the CIA, however, Gordon had begun to put together his own file, a prosecution brief, against Gouliard's government. He kept track of those unions that Gouliard was seating and labeling them as communist. The petroleum workers, the merchant marines, the railroad unions, the communication workers, the bank clerks, and Walters kept him informed on anyone that they viewed as quote unquote subversive. Thus began a time of intense rumor. Gordon was told that Gouliard confided to visitors how enormously he envied Juan Perón because in his day in Argentina, dictator was supposed to have had a button on his desk that could be pushed to send in port workers, for example, out on strike. And there was another button to send them all back to work. Gordon granted that the story was basically propaganda, but they used it. On the surface, there seemed to be just one side to all propaganda. As late as mid-1963, Gouliard was still sounding out the U.S. ambassador before he went forward with any reform. "What would you think," he asked Gordon, "if I were to decree that all of the 10 or 20 kilometers adjoining any federal public works, road, dam, anything, would be expropriated and subdivided among the people?" Gordon replied at length that if the president was truly interested in land reform, that method would be seen as both arbitrary and inadequate. You'd just be left with some peculiar patterns. Gouliard agreed, but he explained that the plan would infuriate his political opponents. It was a gleeful remark of a reformer paying off old scores against conservative opposition. All Gordon saw was considerable disgust. Meanwhile, Gouliard's enemies continued to meet with the ambassador, not only Gordon's personal friends like Ayres and De Paiva, but others whose language seemed extremist to the ambassador, even though Gordon himself was working with the opposition. Within the Brazilian military, traditional political terms were being redefined to satisfy Gouliard's opponents. By any usual measure, General Perry Constant Bevilacqua, the commander of the Second Army in São Paulo, was a conservative. Yet word soon passed through the higher echelons that he was critical of the scheming of men like Silvio Heck. Gouliard might indeed be a menace, the general said, but he had been voted into office and it was up to the people, not the army, to put him out of office. That earned General Perry a reputation for being disloyal. Disloyal to who? His loyalty ought to be to Brazil and the president. But no, he got a file too. Increasingly, the lines were drawn, the Brazilian military officers on one side, and on the other, the labor unions, the peasant leagues, and the majority of the enlisted men. The showdown came in March of 1964 when the U.S. military attachés respected Silvio Heck. They knew that a successful coup could not be led by the Navy, but would require the Army. It would especially require those commanders who were either loyal to Gouliard or hesitant to see their democracy overthrown. One key figure was General Cruel, Kruel, who had replaced General Perry as commander of the Second Army. Cruel's intimacy with Gouliard created a problem, since São Paulo's forces were essentially were essential to the success of the coup. Walters was quoted as telling Brazilian officers that if they really wanted to be helpful, they should prevail on Cruel to join the conspiracy. How's that for the Lieutenant Colonel Defense Attaché organizing the coup in Brazil? Okay, so that gets us up to the precipice of the coup. And we're going to stop there for the weekend. And we will commence on Monday with the rest of the story. What you got, Brit?
I tell you, when you think things couldn't get any deeper or any more shocking as to the depravity of this whole intertwined, I mean, you just keep coming across these same names over and over and over, like Lincoln Gordon, like Vernon Walters. You know, they're just, it really is a small network interwoven into a big network, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, what I like most about this book, though, is the intimate detail that you get on exactly how they orchestrated this. Now, keep in mind that the CIA is doing this, and you can see, if you stand back a couple of feet, this is exactly what they've done in the United States. They have infiltrated our military. They have propagandized the American people. They've got the jackboots, the Union thugs, the illegal aliens that they piped in. This is exactly what's happening today in the United States. The buying up of newspapers, magazines, television, media, every single thing that you're going to hear in this book is being orchestrated inside the United States today. And that's why I really, really was drawn to this book, because once I read the first two chapters, I'm like, holy crap. It has such detail. You know, most of the books, because they cover a whole bunch of different coups, none of them go into this level of depth. The naming of the general officers, the disagreements within the military of what their role is, the different organizations lining up on both, and the smearing of the ones that line up on nationalism being smeared as communist. And what's happening right now, everyone lined up as nationalist in the United States is called a fascist. So this is all the exact same thing that's happening in the United States today. Go ahead, Bridget.
I just text you a copy of a declassified CIA memo that if you want to read it, or if you want, I will. This was from that time frame where it talks about the deputy exposes the CIA in Brazil.
Okay. The accusation is an extremely serious one. National public opinion cannot go unnoticed, and neither can it be allowed that no immediate steps be taken by the President of the Republic and the authorities of national security. The accuser is a man of responsibility, a parliamentarian who deserves the respect of his country. He is Federal Deputy Horio Doria of the PDC from Bahia, who has done outstanding work in the CPI, which investigated the criminal activities of the IBAD and the IPES. Criminal activities, and they were criminals. At present, he belongs to the CPI, which is investigating the activities of foreign press agencies in Brazil. He is also a member of the FPN. So,
and one of the biggest thing is, even further down, they go through about the hidden hand, speaking of CIA, which promoted the coup and overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, the Tomats in Laos, in Vietnam, in the Congo, and in Algiers, those who financed the secret army against de Gaulle. I mean, he literally goes through and just names the names. And again, it goes back to reminding me that every other country knew this was going on. We were the only ones kept in the dark.
Those who overthrew the reformed presidents of Honduras and Santo Domingo to substitute them for guerrilla puppets of the United Fruit Company, those who assassinated President Kennedy in Dallas and shipped weapons along the coast of Venezuela, making it appear that the weapons came from Cuba. All this is precisely the same criminal hand which planned, financed, and executed the plans of IBAD in Brazil and continues to support, under different names, the same underground Nazi fascist organization, i.e., Operation Gladio, that's my ad, which conspires against the security, independence, and development of the Brazilian people. The hand is the secret organization known as the CIA, which since 1947, under President Truman, has centralized the intelligence and espionage service of the different military and civilian departments of the U.S. Yeah.
I'm going to try and find the whole, because these are just excerpts of, and I want to see the whole thing, because that's just, boy, did he nail it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, this came out in 1964. Following is a translation of an exclusive expose given in Brazil's Urgente, Sao Paulo, February 1964 issue, and it was written by the federal deputy Doria. So they knew exactly what was going on in their country as it was going on. They knew that this exact same thing had gone on all over Latin America, and he names it. He knows that it went on in Africa, and he names them. People around the world are very familiar with the CIA and Operation Gladio. As Bridget said, the only people that don't know about it live here in the United States. Thanks for finding that. SR71 and then all along.
Thank you, Colonel, and thank everybody for attending in Spaces in on Rumble today. Absolutely amazing. What really comes out in this book, after everything we've gone through up to this point, is the play-by-play of a playbook that they have already honed to the hilt. We saw it. We saw it happen elsewhere, all across the board, and now they're in South America and in Central America, and they're going crazy with it. It just blows my mind.
Mine too. All along.
Hi, Colonel. I just want to point out, I have done some of reading, like not really extensive, but considerable about the 1964 Brazil coup some years ago, and I kind of noticed a distinction between, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, this book by A.J. Langguth was published in 1978, if I recall, and that's a year that, if not 78, it's definitely around there, I'm pretty sure. But that's so many great books I've noticed were published in that year, and it's kind of makes sense if you think about it, because there's like a lag time in so-called academics and the public in general learning about CIA and being able to talk about it, and that of course relates to the period of journalism in the mid-70s, and also the congressional investigations, for better and worse. We kind of disagree on that. That's still legal. And by contrast, like I read some other books around 1985 and later where there's much less frankness on the degree of U.S. military and CIA involvement in the 1964 Brazil coup. And I think, I am generalizing based on a very small sample size here, but it just goes in terms of broader patterns I've observed, where I just think that by, academia is, you can really see the limitations on what they were permitted to yak about it during the 1980s. There's a real clampdown and limit. I'm just throwing that out there. It's not obviously a sufficiently sample-sized observation, but I've noticed it, across the board on topics way outside of Brazil as well. The other thing I wanted to, comment on is your point about the CIA Office of Public Safety working to sort of cap, as it were, labor unions in Brazil. And this, it's kind of similar in a way to the way that the labor unions have worked with the DNC since, the New Deal ended. And you have, basically union leaders, especially since the purge of 1947, in which, yes, Walter Reuther of UAW was complicit in, the red baiting and elimination of, in that year of key members of the unions. But on the other hand, the left gatekeepers will use that to terminate Walter Reuther, so they don't have to look at Walter Reuther between 1963 and 1968, which is an absolute no-fly zone in the United States of America, in my opinion. And it's just like, in both Brazil and the U.S., it's like, what is really the bad aspect, quote-unquote bad, if I might use that extremely complex term, of unions? It's rank and file, or rather, it's when the rank and file expresses, autonomy against their corrupt leaders who are in alliance with CIA and the international syndicate, right? So in 1968, you had basically Walter Reuther is giving voice to tremendous discontent within the rank and file, not just in the UAW, but as Joseph Palermo points out, it's other union locals were witnessing what he was going on. They were paying attention to the dispute he had been having with George Meany of CIA, AFL-CIO, who's deeply allied, as you know, with CIA, including field offices in Latin America and a deep alliance with the Marshall Plan with CIA in Europe. And, that history of the Walter Reuther, George Meany dispute was not erased for the rank and file union members as it has been for us. And I think it was extremely volatile, and it's just like, look, is the problem really unions or is the problem made to be when the CIA cannot control the unions in both Brazil and the United States? That's the question, I think.
Yeah, that's not even a question, because it is always the problem when they can't control the unions. The unions only become a problem when they can't control them, period. Every single one of these, when there were legitimate union issues with, especially overseas, with U.S. corporations, child labor, whatever it happens to be, if you find an effective union leader, they're going to be assassinated, or they're going to be derided, propagandized, or whatever, and made inept, inefficient, whatever, because it is only the effective union leaders that are a threat to them. And that's been shown to us over and over and over again. SR 71?
Thank you, Colonel. To all along's point, what I'll add is the American Institute for Free Labor Development, the AIFLD, that was founded by the AFL-CIO in 1962. So if anyone thinks the unions here are clean, I'd say take another hard look. Thank you.
Yeah, and they had the Union Training Center in Washington, D.C., where they brought foreign labor um, representatives into Washington, D.C., and basically sheep dipped them just like they did the military officers that we just read about. It is all about bringing them to America. And during the time that they're here, you have to understand there's all kinds of forces at play. There's people trying to blackmail them. There's people trying to bribe them. There's people trying to put them on the CIA payroll. And then when they return to their respective country, they become basically an asset of whether it's the military training, the union training, or whatever. All of those forces are brought to bear, and they are basically going to go back home and do the bidding of the US. They no longer become independent. There are a few exceptions to that, but there are very few exceptions because they are very careful about who they bring in for the training to begin with. Roll along.
Yeah, and on that note of control of the rank and file, I think it's possibly worth noting that there's kind of a somewhat popular history book called Staying Alive, the last days of the working class in the 1970s by a Cornell historian whose name escapes me, but you could easily find the book. And one of the things I notice is very, very, to me, kind of interesting to the point of possibly shady is his portrayal of the Walter Reuther moves of 1968. And what he does is something that is, basically, at the same time Reuther left the UAW in January 68, you also had our good friends, the Teamsters, leaving at the same. Well, isn't that special? It's almost like a defensive end meant to trace the path of the wide receiver,
Right.
And sure enough, our blessed Cornell University Labor Institute historian over here he somehow forgets to mention that Walter Reuther joined the 68 RFK campaign with MLK, and then all three were assassinated. He leaves that part out,
right?
But he simply mentions in his narrative, he sort of braids the narrative of those wacky Teamsters and Walter Reuther in 68. What
right.
An interesting omission and commission our beloved Cornell University Labor Institute historian has given us here.
Yeah, and I want everybody to understand I am not either pro or con on labor unions. I am trying to make the point that they have been very useful for putting boots on the ground for the CIA to manipulate. I have personal experience with the Teamsters. When my dad retired, for a long period of time, he was a long distance truck driver for over 45 years. He was not a union truck driver, but during the time that he drove a truck, several of the places, in order to take loads to, you had to be a union member. So he wasn't like a card carrying, oh my God, I love the unions kind of guy. He did it for several years as an independent truck driver because it was the only way you got work in the Northeast, because it was all unionized up there. And one of the reasons why he moved to Florida was to get out of that. And so during the summer, he didn't do anything associated with the union because he basically was doing fruit and vegetables from Florida to the Midwest. None of that required. But interestingly enough, my only experience, obviously, I had nothing to do other than the civil service union, which was a whole nother story. But that was my only experience. When he retired, he was told, after having spent decades in the Teamsters Union, for the winter time. So it wasn't like a big pension or anything like that. That mysteriously, all of the records of tens of thousands of truck drivers had been burned up in a fire, and that they had no record of him ever being a union member. And he was literally a union member for decades. It took me the better part of 6 months faxing, because my dad did not have a fax, and I'm doing this after hours while I'm still on active duty. And of course, damn sure I would use my rank when I called them son of a bitches, to get my dad's pension. And again, it wasn't a lot, but it was at that point a matter of principle to me. But I literally, and thank God my dad kept extensive receipts. I literally had to fax all of my dad's trips that he did while he was union for like 22 years to these assholes in order to get his pension started. It took me literally about 6 months, back and forth on the phone with them. It was the most ridiculous thing I have ever experienced. All along.
Yeah, Colonel, before I end up under a bridge in the Meadowlands with Jimmy Hoffa, let me just add that I don't want to like blanket condemn the Teamsters, because they were obviously in an ambivalent situation. I mean, the thugs were definitely being used by ownership against labor. That's beyond any question. So it is it's not a black and white issue, in my opinion, regarding them. And also, I mean, if y'all have not seen the movie Hoffa, one could do worse, really. One could do worse than the 1994 movie called Hoffa. But anyway, check it out when you get a chance.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a whole different, yeah. And I think what I think kind of the takeaway for me is that in the United States, we have obviously unions. A lot of our unions, as we've articulated throughout our revelations of our real history, were controlled by the mafia, like all of the longshoremen's up, the control of the ports. We went over all of this. But the fact that we have unions and we regard them largely with disdain because of people like that Weingart woman with the education, the fact that we have them, we're in the mindset that, they have a role. The unions overseas do not function even as crazy as our unions. They don't function like that at all. They were in large part captured by US oligarchs who, if, like I said, you had an effective union member, he was gotten rid of. And that, so when we look at things happening overseas and we're like, well, they have unions, you can kind of write off the fact that obviously their labor concerns are being addressed because they have unions, until you start diving into the unions and basically the fact that all of the leadership was under the control of the oligarchs through these cutouts that were in large part put in place and enforced by CIA and trained by them. So it gives you a completely different false impression of what's going on overseas. And I think a lot of that's on purpose. So anyway, enough of that. Anybody else got anything? Stellar, how are you doing? I can't hear her. Bridget, can you hear her?
Nope. Let me drop you down, Stella, and bring you right back. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh my gosh. I can hear you guys really well, so I was like, oh, everything's all good. I'm hanging in there. She's feisty, stubborn, so she's happy to be at home and stuff. So just, cooking for her, checking in on her, giving her space and stuff, and just praying to God and stuff. And she feels my dad at times. She sees him stuff, but she's doing okay. Totally shocked and happy about all this stuff finally happening and coming out, feeling bad that there's so much division. And like you had mentioned, this is what's is happening here full blown, like what's been going on in the past in these other countries and coups that were all manipulated by the international syndicate, because it's not just one country, it's the whole group of them. But I do feel that there's a lot of stuff that is being exposed, and even though people are like, oh, this Elon thing, he is dark MAGA. So I hope that people are kind of seeing that, it's a psyop within a psyop, because there's so many deep-bedded operatives, in my personal opinion, that are out there, just like back in the day, and the operations that you've been just explaining, so yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, Stellar is having some family health, not her, but family health issues. Please, if you pray, please put her on your prayer list. I know that would be greatly appreciated.
Amen. We got to lock arms.
Yep.
And in this way.
Absolutely. Okay.
There's more going on too. So I was reading statistics, because I always watch these different stupid stuff and things. So over the last week, pretty much since about the 2nd or the 3rd of July, up until probably 2 days ago, yesterday, maybe coming up right now, but heart attacks are a lot more prevalent right now. So people that have weak hearts, pacemakers, family members that are, in that kind of compromised things, there's a lot more going on, with the weather stuff, the microwaves that they're shooting out, the energies and things that are coming up. There's a pole reversal. I know you guys don't believe that stuff, but there is a pole reversal you can see in some of the South Oceans. Some of the South Oceans, though, are going the opposite direction. And you can even like on Schumann, it flipped for over 24 hours right before the 4th of July. But there are a lot more I don't know if it's because of what they're doing with all the microwaves that they're spreading all over the place. You can see them shooting microwaves all over the coast, throughout the middle. There's a lot of really strange things happening. I don't know if it's like I think that there's more warfare going on than what is led to meet the eye with all these different storms. Even here in Vegas, what happened, with all those pole lines and the swift winds that came out of nowhere. I just think that, we need to pray for everybody and, pray that people stay safe. Keep your children close to you. There's a lot of really bad stuff going on.
That's true. And just so that everybody knows, especially over on Rumble, I was not laughing at what Stellar said. I was laughing at what the part where she said, I know you guys don't believe in those things. Oh gosh. Weather warfare is for real. The different aspects of it, of course, a lot of it we know, and a lot of it we don't know. But that weather warfare is a fact. They have used it repeatedly. So understand that part of it is real. And again, we have no idea what the extent of their capability is, but we were conducting weather warfare decades and decades and decades ago. So that part is definitely real. But I just love the way she says, I know you guys don't believe that. Anyway.
Well, because I know that I'm like so much far over on the conspiracy stuff. You guys have all the factual things, and if they're able to manipulate through, either microwaves or whatever frequencies these do things, they're also shooting them up as well. So if they're able to manipulate like the ionosphere and the different ones up there, I don't know if they're all broken down too, but like way up there, who's to say that they're not able to use some of these things down in the ocean bottoms? Because there truly is stuff going on within some of these oceans or seas where the currents are literally going the opposite direction. So, it just makes you wonder.
It definitely makes you wonder. I agree with that. And obviously, the only reason I don't even generally comment on any of that is because I don't want to take away from the material that we present. Not that I don't care if you guys talk about it, but I tend to stick to what I know for factual, because obviously, at some point, Operation Gladio is going to become very mainstream. And when people are looking for that material, it's very important that there be material out there that they can find that legitimately is exposing it. So that's what we're hoping for. Anyway, all right, guys, thanks for being here today. I appreciate it. I'm going to jump off of here, go have some dinner. And you guys have a great weekend. I do have a few articles that throughout the weekend I will jump on and do. I will try to give you a 30-minute notice like I did today. I understand everybody's going to be busy, but hopefully I can get to a few more of those so I can close those tabs too. It's just material that I've come across doing other research that I believe it's significant enough to do a live podcast about it. But it's not something that I'm going to do at our 4:00 show because I like the what we're doing here as far as the book reviews and stuff. I think it's much more healthy from a consistency standpoint than jumping all over doing different subjects. So I will keep them at different times. So anyway, thanks for being here, everybody. Take care. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you, Colonel Towner, and unions suck.
Thanks, Stellar. Okay, guys. I did want to say, incidentally, it's against Geneva Convention, of which we agreed to, Donnie Vision. Absolutely. She needs to host a space about that weirdness. I agree. Because there's a lot of very, very smart people out there. And thank you, SR71, for posting about Vernon Walters. Definitely very bad guy. Maker Sarge, Jungle Operations Training Center, Banana Boat Patch. Yep. If you drive by Fort Leavenworth, you can't see any of the buildings except for the original prison building. I definitely, as you guys know, I love visiting our military bases on our trips. I have been to Kansas, but I only stopped there a couple of different times, and I did not go to Fort Leavenworth. It is definitely on my bucket list to visit. I do think it would be very interesting. Okay, that's it. You guys have a nice weekend. Take care.